the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Saint Maximilian Kolbe is a patron saint of drug addicts, of journalists. He is a man who died in concentration camps of Auschwitz. But he was born Raymond Colby back in 1894. And you might know the story, you may not. I'll give you the quick version of it. He was a pretty wild boy. I was the same way. I was very rambunctious. I gave my mother, I'm sure, a lot of sleepless days and nights. But his mother asked him a question. What's ever going to become of you? And for some reason, that question pierced his heart. He got very upset, and he went down to church, and he knelt before the Virgin Mary, the statue of the Virgin Mary, and she actually appeared to him. He had a vision of her. And she handed him 2 crowns. She had 2 crowns. One was red, one was white. One was a symbol of purity, and the other was a symbol of martyrdom. And she asked which one he wanted, and he took both. And, of course, he became a Franciscan Friar, and as a result of that, he had the crown of purity. But years later, he would be challenged in a new way, where he'd have to ultimately lay down his life. He was an amazing young man. He grew into this great leader. He founded radio stations. He founded magazines. His mission was evangelization. I loved him. When he was in seminary, he saw the Masons holding parades through the streets of Rome. It was right where he was studying. And they were demonstrating against the church. So Kolbe's mission, he set about counteracting them. And you might have heard of the Militia Immaculata in Poland. These were members who devoted themselves to the conversion of sinners and really this battle against Freemasonry, Pope Leo XIII as well. And what did he do? He used the miraculous medal as a way of spreading devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Kolbe suffered sickness like all the great saints. You take a look at Bernadette Soubirous or St. Faustina. All the great saints suffered. And it's so weird because he nearly died from tuberculosis when he was in the seminary. That's the same thing that took Faustina's life. He would go on to finish his doctoral dissertation, and the rest of his life, he was ultimately weakened by sickness. So if you are struggling right now, sometimes God allows us crosses. They're for our own good, our own holiness, and they're powerful spiritual tools and weapons to bring about the conversion of others and really to amplify our prayers. Some of the things he did, just very quickly, he published a magazine called The Night of the Immaculata. Some say, I don't know how true this is, but they said he had a run of about 750,000. Others say it was more than 1 million. That's a huge accomplishment. He started a daily newspaper called the Little Daily. And he had a press run of about 137 on work days, 225,000 on Sundays. He started the City of the Immaculata. That was a monastery with 18 friars. 10 years later, that monastery ended up being one of the largest group of religious men in the world. He had 800 friars living and working there. Then he went to Japan. He arrived there with no money. He was literally penniless. He didn't know a word of Japanese. And within a month, he started a Japanese language version of his magazine. And today that monastery is the center of the Franciscan outreach in Japan. So Neil was sharing with me that he started a radio station at the monastery in Poland. He even had plans to get this out. And what I found fascinating is that he learned about radio actually in Japan. This monastery or this radio station that he had, Kolbe understood the power and the influence of radio. He understood how critical it was in terms of evangelization. Neil says this, Kolbe got the construction permit for the radio station, and he said, children, do you realize what this will mean for our outreach? He says, soon daily, we'll have the ability to reach thousands of countrymen over the airways. Now with radio, we should win even more members of the Militia Immaculata. I can't imagine how many lives were uplifted, how many lives were converted, how many lives were saved because of that. And that's how God uses radio. And Relevant Radio's carrying on that very same mission. And I hope you'll be able to support us. As I share with you some of these stories, and I'm going to share another great miracle that took place in the concentration camps with a man named Rudolf Hoss. It's a Divine Mercy miracle coming up. You can go online to relevantradio.com and make a pledge and help Relevant continue to do, as Kolbe said, reach souls, to reach more souls. Kolbe was ultimately arrested by the Gestapo. Hitler was rounding up Catholics. He was rounding up philosophers. He was rounding up Jews. A lot of people think just Jews went to concentration camps. That's not really the case. He actually was arrested first, one time by the Gestapo, then released. A year later, was rearrested. He went ahead and ended up in Auschwitz. And this is where his story, I think, really begins. He survived in a camp as long as he did. One, it's remarkable. If you ever have a chance to travel to Poland or to Germany or any place where these concentration camps are, you have to. It will change your life. When I saw the horrors that these men and women had to endure, what ended up happening one night, there was a prisoner who escaped from his cell block. And he wanted to try to get out. He couldn't stand the horrors of this concentration camp. And he got caught. And everyone, as a result, was rounded up. And anybody who tried to escape, if you did this, and even if you were successful, you would know for the rest of your life that you put 10 other people to death, because that was the policy. Some prisoner escaped from a cell block, and everybody that day had to stand in the sun the entire day without eating or drinking. Imagine standing all day just like that. Then 10 prisoners were selected from that group, and they were selected to be put to death by starvation. They were going to put in the starvation bunker. And I prayed before the starvation bunker. It's a tiny little horrific cell where these people went in, and the guards would say they'd hear people screaming and cursing, and there would be this vile just sound that would come as people slowly were dying. And so Kolbe knew what was going to happen. And at some point, he stepped forward and he took his place. He went up to the commandant. And the commandant said, "What are you doing?" And he had this little P on his shirt with an X through it so they could identify who it is. What's this Polish pig want? Said the commandant. And they were shocked. He went to reach for his gun because who would step out of line? Normally you're met with clubs and with whips. And he says, "I want to take the place of this man." And the man thought he was insane, but for some reason he let that man live. And Kolbe took his place. And Kolbe went to the starvation bunker with 9 other men. And they say they survived for 2 weeks. And instead of the curses and the vile nature that would come from that place, they heard beautiful hymns. Kolbe heard their confessions. They prayed the rosary. Finally, everybody died but Kolbe. He survived 2 weeks without food, without water. And finally, he had to be killed by being injected with carbolic acid. And ultimately was put in the ovens of Auschwitz. His ashes sent into the air. It's a horrible story, but it's a heroic story. Kolbe was a man of purity. He was a man dedicated to evangelization and a man who understood sacrifice and martyrdom. And how did I get a relic of St. Maximilian Kolbe, a man who went to his death in the concentration camps, one of the great saints of the 20th century, right? It's very interesting. The monastery that he established about 25 miles west of Warsaw became a publishing center, as we were talking about what he did. And you'll see Kolbe with this very long beard. It's often pictured in a lot of those publications that go out. When he went to Japan to evangelize, he grew a beard because his beard would separate him from everybody else over there. And there was a guy who wrote a book. He wrote a book called Maximilian Kolbe, Martyr of Charity. If you want to read about his story, do that. He said that Kolbe chose to keep his beard upon his return from 6 years of missionary work in Japan. And in those days, it was customary for missionaries to grow these very long beards. And Kolbe wanted to keep it as a reminder of his mission days. But as you know what was happening in Poland, the Nazis, and this is 1939, invaded Poland, and he made the decision to shave it. He did that so he wouldn't stand out. He said, "Look, beards provoke the enemy who rapidly are approaching our friary. Our Franciscan habits also will provoke them. I can part with my beard," he says, "but I cannot sacrifice my habit." So what he did is he had one of his fellow friars shave his beard, right? And the brother tried to save the beard. And Kolbe saw him and he said, "Hey, throw that out." So the friar said, "Okay." And he threw it into a stove obediently, and they were going to dispose of it. But then a little bit later, he decided to retrieve those particles of Kolbe's long beard. And he stored it in a pickle jar. And that's what he did. And today, the only surviving first-class relics of Kolbe are of his beard. And that's what we have here. There's a piece or two, and you can see it, Josh. There's a couple pieces of his beard right there. And that was just a grace of God, right? Such a wonderful grace. The man who he stood in line in the concentration camp for, he went on and had children and ended up testifying to the heroism of Kolbe in those concentration camps. So we're blessed to have that incredible record. From darkness and from overwhelming horror comes goodness. I think of Edith Stein went there and showed love and mercy to those that were in there. One of the men who was in charge of the concentration camps in Auschwitz was a guy named Rudolf Haas, and I wrote about him in my book on Divine Mercy. And again, there's lots of concentration camps, but Auschwitz was the most notorious death camp that the Nazis ever devised. And this commandant, he oversaw the killing of about 2,500,000 people there. 2.5 million people went to death. And he testified at Nuremberg that another 500,000 people died from disease and starvation. I mean, if you could see the latrines, if you could see where they had to sleep, you'd be surprised anybody survived. So he was reassigned at one point, and then he came back to oversee the killing of another 40,000 Hungarian Jews. And people called Haas an animal. He was the one who decided to use the pesticide Cyclone B in those gas chambers to make them more efficient. And he would put 2,000 people to death every hour. This man was a monster. Huge numbers of victims were Jews. Of course, the Nazis, they exterminated Catholics and Poles and all sorts of people. So if anyone should be condemned to hell for all eternity for his crimes, I mean, this man tortured people and would put them to death in unimaginable ways. But something happened on the way to the inevitable, on his way to hell. When the war ended, he tried to disguise himself as a gardener, but he was discovered by British soldiers, and they beat that tar out of him, right? And they were ultimately ordered to stop the beating, and he was imprisoned actually in Poland. He was guarded by Polish guards. And he thought, oh my gosh, I'm really going to get it now, because these are the men who lost their wives. These are the fathers, the mothers, the children, right? These men are going to torture me. What am I going to do? And he was terrified. They thought he'd be killed even instantly. But that was not the case. What he saw from these guards was mercy. And it was a turning point in his life. He experienced such a profound conversion. He was raised Catholic, but he abandoned his faith. So he calls for a priest. Nobody wanted to come hear his confession. He remembered that. He remembered that there was a Jesuit superior who had broken into the camp once. And it was a weird story. I mean, the whole community of Jesuits had been rounded up. By coincidence, this one priest, wanted to come in to evangelize. He was captured, broke into the camp. The guards discovered him. They took him to the commandant, expecting him to be put to death. And instead, the commandant freed him. They let him go. It was that very man that came to hear this man, Rudolf Haas' confession. And his confession was so deep and so profound, it went on for a long time. Father Lawn was the name of this priest. He granted him absolution. The next day, he was to be executed. Haas was going to be executed for his crimes. And Father Lawn brought him communion, gave him viaticum at the time. And mercy changed his life in such a profound way. And I'm giving you the thumbnail of this. You can learn more about it in my book, and you can read his story. It's a powerful one. But from the notorious death camp of Auschwitz, from the horrors of this commandant, mercy and love transformed him. He encountered Christ in the sacraments. And this is the God that we worship, right? It doesn't matter how scarlet your sin, what kind of crime you've committed. He told St. Faustina that the greater the sinner, the greater the right you have to his mercy. And I think that's a message that the world needs to hear today, doesn't it? I mean, it's so critical. There's so many people in our own lives that perhaps deserve that same type of mercy. I hope through Rudolf Haas and the example of those who gave it to him that we can learn to extend that same type of mercy. So may St. Maximilian Kolbe and Rudolf Haas and all those who've gone before us, may they pray for us. If you can help Relevant Radio right now with your act of mercy, I know we're going to change lives. We're going to bring this message of forgiveness and mercy to so many others. Call right now, 877-291-0123, or go online to relevantradio.com and pledge. You will make a difference. Trust me.